Hi, I'm Kieran O'Meara, and you're listening to poLit, the podcast for political posits. Hi everyone, and welcome to the 14th episode of the poLit podcast, the podcast for political posits. I'm really excited for you to be joining me today because we have a cracking discussion lined up. If you haven't already done so, check out last week's discussion with Sam Mace from the University of Leeds, where Sam and myself discussed the political theorist Carl Schmitt and the relationship of his theory of the state of exception to contemporary Syria. Alongside that, if you haven't already done so, please go to the blog. There should be a link in the description box where you'll be able to check out all the content that doesn't become a podcast episode. Alongside that, please like, share, subscribe, and follow. It would mean the absolute world to me. Okay, so today I am joined by Dr. Francesco Belcastro, who is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Derby and a fellow at the Centre for Syrian Studies at the University of St Andrews. Okay, so Dr. Belcastro, I'd like to begin with one question to get the ball rolling. How are sport and politics connected?
Well, hello, Kieran, and thanks for having me. Very glad to be here. So this is a question to which really I don't have only one answer, and it's very much what my research is looking at. The relation between sport and politics is very complex, so they are related in many ways. And one way of answering this is telling you how I got to research this particular area, which is
Sure.
I actually started by looking at how sport and particularly sport events can be used for political purposes. So a good example there would be, say, a country organizing a big sport event. Could be an Olympics, a regional tournament, or whatever, and the country attaching a particular image or view of the country itself, kind of country branding. This is something that a lot of people have looked at. However, what I wanted to look at is the idea that maybe you can sort of organize sport events or set up a sport team and do it for a bit more complex political reasons. So my initial interest was sport and politics are certainly connected, and I wanted to look at how sport and sport events can be used for political reasons. When I looked at this, when I got into the topic a bit more, then I found that there's way more to this relation. But initially, as a big sports fan, it was sort of that was my starting point, I would say.
Sure. Okay, that's interesting. So, if you don't mind me asking, how do you define a sport event or a sports event?
So I don't really look so much at sport events in terms of like their organization. I mean, I've looked at a couple of events, and I mean, I've looked at the Giro d'Italia, so a cycling race, and football matches. So really, any sort of professional event would be something that I'm interested in, that requires some sort of effort to organize it, and it usually involves either international federation or professional clubs. Would be something that I've looked at or I'm interested in at the moment. I've not done anything on grassroots, but I've not really worked on definition of sporting events so much, because, as I said, like my interest is a bit more on the kind of relation between sport and politics. I'm not really a sociologist of sport, so even though I'm very interested in what they do, I'm not really, there's not really my area of interest.
Sure.
So I'm afraid I cannot answer that particular question, Kieran. Sorry.
That's okay. No worries. Okay, so something I'd like to move to a little bit is you've recently published a paper in the Journal of Mediterranean Politics entitled "Sport, Politics, and the Struggle Over Normalization in Post-Oslo Israel and Palestine." And I'd like to pull a quote from this particular paper, if you don't mind, which is "Sport and major sporting events provide a unique lens into the politics of conflict-ridden contexts." Can you speak a little bit to that? Can you speak a little bit to how it's not, your focus isn't just necessarily the relationship between politics and sport, but the relationship between conflict or conflictual contexts and
Yeah,
sport.
certainly. And I will use also this case study of Palestine Israel because it seems to me it's a very interesting one, and it's one from which you can kind of you can look at it and it's a good case study to not only to the region, but I think more in general on areas of conflict, as you mentioned. I think every conflict, particularly one that it's been going on for very long, and that has so much symbolic value attached to it, and so much international audience, if you want. It's also a conflict over narratives. It's not only a conflict, and in the case of Palestine Israel now, it's largely a conflict over narratives, particularly in the international arena. So what I want to look in the article, it's how in this context, in the context of conflict, of sort of contested politics, if you want to put it that way, how sport can be used to put forward support and if you want, advertise a certain narrative of the conflict itself. So from the point of view of Israel, I was looking at the Giro d'Italia, which is a cycling race for those who are maybe not familiar with it, and the fact that the Giro d'Italia, it's a stage tour, so there's like 28 stages, and it's hosted obviously in Italy. It's one of the main cycling races, but on occasions it started from other countries, and for the first time in its history in 2018, it started from Israel. Now this was quite puzzling because Israel hasn't got much of history as a cycling nation, and the country invested quite a lot of money in making this happen. So why was it? What was Israel's interest in this? There's obviously like people that care about cycling there, but when you go and unpick the narrative, when you go and see what actually people that organize it, the way that they portray it, there's a quite conscious attempt to use cycling to describe Israel as a modern Western nation, and sport and this particular sport is something kind of like rich Western and modern countries do, and obviously as opposed to the other inhabitants of that particular region that don't cycle, therefore they're not. And also, so this was one aspect which I was interested in, and also the same case study, so in Palestine and Israel, I looked at this friendly that was organized between Israel and Argentina before the World Cup, so in 2018 in June, and how this was used by Palestinians and their allies as a kind of catalyst for protest. So there was, So basically, it's a long story, but I'm going to kind of give you a very brief account. So this match was meant to be in Haifa, I believe, and then it was moved to Jerusalem. And obviously, because of Jerusalem's contested status in international politics, this was something quite controversial. So people that opposed these Palestinians and their international allies were able to mount a strong campaign and exercise pressure not only on the Argentinian Federation but on players themselves, to the point that Argentina and the Argentinian Football Federation cancelled the match. And what is more interesting, reports were that they cancelled the match under pressure from some of the Argentinian players. They said, "I don't want to play. I'm not going to play." So that's quite interesting. How sport can be used to kind of to really, one is a narrative of a modern country where there is no conflict, where what you used to see in the news, it's in the past, and the other one it's one that underlines the occupation essentially and contested. So
No, really, really fascinating. Really, really fascinating. One of the questions I wanted to ask is sort of a more in response to this, is a more sort of standard international relations question, which is: would you say there's a relationship in this case between sport and soft
absolutely,
power?
and a lot of the literature has looked at sport and within the context of soft power. So definitely you've got a good point there. But I think it's in contested in areas of sort of contested politics, if you want to call it, in areas of conflict, whatever you prefer. I think that your soft power is a starting point. Certainly, it helps us somehow. But yeah, I like this idea of thinking about it as kind of conflicting narratives. But certainly, I mean, the literature has dedicated quite a lot of attention to sport as a tool of soft power, and obviously you also have the literature on sport as a conflict resolution tool, which I don't really engage much with because they do quite different things. You know, the idea that, say, you get people, I don't know, you give them table tennis or football or whatever, and you get them to play as children, and then they grow up, they'll be friends. That kind of, you know, conflict resolution, grassroots approach. So one level is sort of the international soft diplomacy, which I think has to do more maybe with major events, and then there is this other aspect which I deal less with, which is the more kind of grassroots conflict resolution aspect to it.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. It is interesting. Okay, so I have another question off the back of this, of course, which is, in what way do the sort of large institutions of sport fall into this? So, when we talk about things like the Olympic organizations, or if we talk about something like FIFA, how do they fall into this sort of relationship between politics and sport?
Well, they're very important. Yeah,
that's a big question. I know
it's a very good one, and I mean, they're very important. They play a crucial role. They, in many ways, could be seen as reflecting the lines and the balances and imbalances in the international system. And FIFA is the perfect example there. It has seen several attempts to I don't know if politicize it is the right word, but I've seen a lot of politics, not only politics of sport, but politics as in among nations taking place there in relation to Palestine and Israel, but in other cases as well. And also, I guess there is a quite strong reference or quite strong mirroring of the whole capitalist system and the economic system under which we operate, and not only FIFA. Obviously, you mentioned the example of the Olympics as well. So one could say that these institutions are, in a way, are you could see them as referees in sport and politics related disputes. But one might argue that they're not very fair referees because they have a vested interest in carrying out a particular agenda that is in part dictated by their own members and in part by their own management, if you want. So, but they are very important. I think the example of Palestine and Israel is probably the best one because the best one I can think of, because there's been a lot of debates about particularly the role of Israeli teams that are based in the settlements, which are contested. Obviously, the settlements are illegal under international law. So if you take a strict interpretation of that, teams that are playing from settlements shouldn't be allowed to take place in FIFA or UEFA tournaments, and the Israeli Federation shouldn't be allowed to host them. And the Palestinians have been trying to enforce this with lack of success. But I think we're gonna see more of that from the point of view of institutional involvement. So FIFA has been trying to kind of say that, ironically, that this is a political matter, and they don't want to get into this, which that would counter that. As I said before, sport is incredibly political. So saying this is not politics, it's not really a sustainable position to me, not in the long term, at least.
Sure, that's really interesting though that you speak about settlements. I hadn't even thought about that, to be honest. That's really, really interesting. And I have to ask, just because it obviously occurred this week, do you have any preliminary thoughts on the Israeli elections that took place in the last week?
Well, I'm not an expert on Israeli politics myself, so I'm not going to say much. But it seems to me that there's still that not much has changed, and then we have to wait whether there is any defection from one bloc or the other. But it seems to be as stuck as it was before. Now I don't know how
Yeah, just
much
about.
Israeli politics in the short term, what happens there affects the relation with the Palestinians, because the situation at the moment, it's such a distance that I don't think that even Netanyahu going, if that's ever going to happen, would really have a massive effect in the short term. I think we are in a phase in which we are looking at either we're looking at like major systemic changes, or doesn't really, so little shifts in the Israeli political system might not change much. But as I said, I'm not an expert on Israeli domestic politics, so yeah, I don't want to. I can't say more.
That's
No,
okay.
it's
Thank you.
good. It's good to
I
chat
couldn't
about it,
resist.
but yeah,
Sure. And just back on sport in Palestine quickly. I don't actually know the answer to this question. What is the most
it'd be
popular
football.
sport in
It'd be
Palestine?
football. Yeah, it'd be
You might
football.
not
Yeah,
know the answer.
definitely. Yeah,
Oh, it will be
yeah.
football. Yeah, yeah. No, fantastic, interesting. Okay, so speaking about football, one thing I'd like to move to is to ask you which football clubs are uniquely political, and why would you pick
Okay,
them
that's a
out?
very good question, and I've got a long answer to this, or a short one. So I'm gonna start with the short one. I think like every club, every football club that is somehow related to identity in any way, it's political, and I'll explain you what I mean by that. So you'll typically have
Yeah,
clubs
please.
that represent communities, that represent I don't know, ethnic groups, religious groups, sectarians, whatever, and when there is this representation, I think the clubs are already political in a sense, because they represent political identities, or other identities. Now, most
Yeah.
clubs, at least in their origins, they were born, and they, when they were originated, they represented some sort of identity. And one might argue that with the sort of emergence of modern globalized football, you've lost a lot of these identity related nature of the sport itself. And you have, in some cases, I think the Premier League would be a good example there, because most people
Okay.
that, or most of the global audience, you have people that follow the Premier League from literally everywhere in the world, and to
Yeah.
most of them, identity doesn't really play much of a role in choosing a football club, or supporting one over the other. It's they global audiences in the Middle East, or in the Indian subcontinent, or in Australia, or in the US, in most cases will support Liverpool or Man City, because they like Salah or De Bruyne, or because they like red, or they like Blue Moon, or whatever, So there's not much to that.
Sure.
So obviously it's different to a domestic audience, isn't it? Because most of us would, I mean, I'm
Yeah,
not
sure.
exactly a domestic audience. I'm a half domestic audience, if you want to put it that way. Most people that that grew up in this country still associate teams with a certain kind of identity. I would say, though, that if you look at football more globally, and even if you look at British football more generally, not only focusing on this kind of global image of the Premier League, you'll find that a lot of clubs still are very political in many ways, and I think, like, I mean, I'm speaking from Glasgow, and obviously Celtic and Rangers would be an excellent example there.
Yeah, a really good example of that.
And people often focus on the sectarian dividing in Glasgow, but reference to the whole issue of Scottish independence between Celtic and Rangers supporters is just as big. Then I would add that there are some clubs, and maybe we can move on to some of those later on, which are incredibly political,
Yeah.
or they represent, or sort of, they were born with political goals, or represent, incarnate a particular political cause. So you could call them like extra political teams, or teams that for a short amount of history, of their history, incarnated a particular ideology, and then this changed. So yeah, again, I don't have a single answer, but I think it's part of what makes it very fascinating, isn't it? This relation with sport, but it's very complex. And I'm sure
Yeah,
if you
it
ask,
is.
10 of your listeners, well, what team you would say it's more political, you'll find different answers. Some people will tell you, people that are teams that are very much on the political left or the political right. Some people will think more teams that represent a particular identity or a particular community. So yeah, you could look at it in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Fascinating. Okay, so moving on from this a little bit, or sort of speaking to this. So I know you're a supporter of
I
two teams. Would you like to tell the audience, for the sake of for the
I
sake of
have to correct
unbiasedness,
you. I'm a supporter of many
as to
teams
your two
because
teams?
as a lot of people that lived in different places and have done different things, I got I got to support different teams. So and again, I guess it goes back to this idea of identity, because like I would now tell you that my football club is a football club called Acilocri, from the town where I am from in South Italy, which is a small fifth division
Right.
team in Italy. And I obviously always, and that's where I used to go to the stadium as a kid, and I've always supported them. But in a way, living while abroad, or getting, becoming British, if that's the thing. So after 15 years, that's the thing. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
no, that
I've
is a
seen
thing.
it. Yes, I don't want to get into that
Yeah.
debate on the basis of recent interviews that have been circulating. So yeah. So, and not living back home, not living at home, and over 20 years now, almost 20 years, I kind of developed more of an allegiance or affection for that team, because now it represents home for me more than anything else. And then I obviously have,
Yeah, no.
as you know,
Yeah,
I in the Premier League, I'm a Liverpool sympathizer, but that's for completely different reasons. That's because I particularly liked one historical Liverpool team when I was a kid, and I liked some of their players. And then there are a few teams that I follow for different reasons. Bigger Italian team that is from my region, or so I think I've looked so much into this. I cannot be an honest supporter anymore. I always have second motives for supporting a team. Yes, yes.
for supporting a team. Interesting. So there's just one thing that's sort of on my mind when saying about that I hadn't thought about beforehand, which is, do you think with this is a bit of a leading question, but do you think with the onset of globalization, then there's been a bit of a deterritorialization of sort of the relationship between local football teams and identity, or the relationship between those who don't sit in a
Yeah, I
territory and a
think there's
particular
been
football team?
at high level, if you want, at top tiers of football, particularly of a few leagues which are internationalized. And I guess that the Premier League is an excellent example. And I'm not saying necessarily it's a negative thing, right? It's maybe if you compare
No, no,
the
no, no,
Premier League
no.
now with the Premier League when it started in 1992. Can't remember the year. I don't know. You could say, well, the quality of football has improved, and we have, we get the best players in the world playing here. So that's positive. But I guess at least at
Sure.
that level, certainly. But then if you go and look at the whole kind of different leagues, there are still cases. I mean, some of the most interesting cases actually are in England. I know AFC Wimbledon and clubs that represent communities. So I think there is
Oh
still
yeah.
very
That's
strong identification, and you find very often that now a lot of people will support a sort of a kind of global team, if you want, in addition to their local team. So I don't necessarily think it has kind of erased this connection. But certainly, like, I don't know, I don't think Liverpool and Everton are a good example. I don't think to most people around of England, the social distinctions that, or I don't know, ethnic, religious distinction that 40 years ago might have been important to the Liverpool-Everton rivalry matter anymore to most of the global audience. So yeah, so I think it's kind
yeah.
of created two-tier kind of two levels, if you want. But I think you'll always have this idea of local identification and kind of regional and territorial pride. has always been there. It will always be there. I don't think that for all of the attempts of creating a super Champions League or other ridiculous tournaments, they'll be able to destroy that. I think sport is too political for this to disappear completely.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It's interesting, and I think you're right with that. Actually, I think it is too political for this to disappear completely. And so, I have a question for you, which is something that I ask every guest that comes on the podcast, which is, how do you understand politics?
Oof.
What do you understand the
See,
political to be?
that's why one should never hang
I know,
out with
huge
theorists,
question.
because you guys always ask these questions, and I do way more empirical stuff. So, I mean, this is a big question. I don't know if I can answer it, but I think,
Yeah.
So what was the question again? What do I understand to be politics or the political? Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess this is gonna have to go through some serious editing here, and I'm telling you before. This question, I want to have first editing powers over this one. So I think politics has to do with and this is probably not a very good answer. Has to do with human beings and how they exercise power and how they organize themselves, and different forms of interaction. And I think it has to do with human beings and society and relations among human beings in societies and among different societies. I don't know whether there's a good answer or not. Probably not, but
No, that's a lovely answer. That's a lovely answer. There was also in my head there, I was trying to connect the word exercise with sport
that
somewhere
didn't think about
alongside
that. That could have probably been an easier way out. Too late.
And very last question for you, Dr. Belcastro, is if someone wanted to read a little bit more about the relationship between sports and politics, who would you recommend?
So, most of my research has been on Palestine, Israel. So the first thing that I could think of are on Palestine and Israel. There is a bit of literature on. Let me actually. I think I've got a reading list somewhere here. One thing I would recommend, certainly, is to start by reading about some interesting cases of football clubs. Now, we only spoke about football. Obviously, it's not only about football. There is. There
Oh, yeah,
are
no, not at all, not at all.
other sports which are very interesting for this relation again. The first example that comes to mind, it's boxing and national pride. Yeah, there's obviously a whole
Oh, yeah.
gender dimension there, and all dimension of idea of masculinity, but also idea of fighter representing the fighting spirit of a particular country, and how that plays in how it then is used for domestic narratives, and how often boxers, successful ones, after they retire, they go into politics. So that's kind of the other way around. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So, and
Yeah, no,
obviously
I never thought about that. I
it's
never
an
thought about
individual
that.
sport, and because it entails a certain level of violence, it kind of it talks to slightly different values, if you want, from football, and it's very interesting. So there are a few things which I would recommend. So the first one would be, I would advise your listeners to go and read about the few football teams. So one would be the first one that comes to mind. It's Corinthians, the Brazilian team, and a phenomenon called Democracia Corintiana, which is a very interesting phase in which Corinthians, during the dictatorship in Brazil, was essentially ruled as a democratic system, where everybody, from people that were cleaning the stadium to the president, just had the vote on every decision that was made by the club. And there is a lot of things available online to find. I'm trying to think of any academic thing to read, but I cannot think of any. But I could mention other couple of cases. So there is a Club Deportivo Palestino, and it's very interesting because it kind of became it's a club funded by Palestinian migrants in Santiago de Chile in Chile, and it kind of became a sort of reference point for for all Palestinian migrants, not only in Chile but all around the world. It kind of became a symbol of Palestinian pride and of the Palestinian diaspora. I mean, for those people who are more interested in theory, I know there's like Pierre Bourdieu wrote quite a lot on sport and politics. There is quite a lot from the point of view of sociology of sport. And there is a, I remember there's like sport and international relations handbook published by Routledge. It's got quite a few different cases, and then there's a lot of good stuff done at the regional level. I actually not very good with names, but there is also I think it's called Routledge Handbook of Sport, Gender, and Sexuality for those people who are more interested in the gender dimension. And then I would suggest certainly to go and look at regional cases. So the cases of Palestine, Israel, it's a very interesting one. There's quite a lot of stuff written on that. In general, there's a very good volume, which I think is it called Sport and Politics in the Middle East? Can't remember the title, which came out recently and contains different cases, not only sport, politics, and society in the Middle East. That's the name, which is Oxford University Press. That would be a very good starting point. So there's a lot of stuff, and I mean, if you people want to send me an email and ask any reading recommendation, I'd be happy to do that. And as my job, I'm always always happy to do that. But yeah, it's I mean, it's not. I know you're a theory guy, but it's quite accessible to people who are not very much into IR theory and are more into sort of empirical or kind of contemporary politics, if you want. It doesn't require a lot of engagement with theory to enjoy it. So.
Yeah, and I think that's so important as well, because sport is one of those things that we experience. If you're a sporty person, or even from school, you have PE lessons, you have games lessons, and it's something there that I think can bring more people into the study of, or into political studies than perhaps before. But okay, so thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Show, Dr. Belcastro. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for the chat,
once again.
And thank you very much. Bye bye.
So I've been talking with Dr. Francesco Belcastro on sport, politics and international relations. If you'd like to get in contact with Dr. Belcastro, you'll be able to find their Twitter handle in the description box. Alongside that, there is a link to the blog where you'll be able to find lots of content which doesn't become a podcast episode. Please like, share, subscribe and follow. It'll mean the world to me. And don't forget to tune in next week. I look forward to it. Thank you for listening.